So what gets in the way? Stress gets in the way. Have you all heard about stress? Yeah, you guys have heard about it. It's a variable. Yeah. Have you heard it's going to kill you? Have you heard that? That's the one that's really popular right now. It used to be margarine. Margarine was going to kill us in the 90s. I remember going to people's houses and walking in and be like, oh my gosh, there's margarine in the refrigerator. That's going to wipe out their family. But now it's stress. That's what we got to be worried about. But what's really interesting is stress innately isn't bad. Stress is not a bad thing. Stress actually improves humans' performance, right? We actually need a little bit of stress. If you didn't have any stress, you would be bored, right? You wouldn't do any work if you didn't have a deadline. You'd be over there on the continuum where your performance is suffering. You might feel calm, but there's nothing really great happening. We need some stress to actually motivate us. Now, it's interesting. Stress is a hormone. It's called cortisol. It kind of flows through our blood. The interesting thing is when we have a nice balance of stress, our work feels energized. We feel focused. Time seems to go by really quickly. You'll know if you're in this state. We call it flow. You'll know you're in flow, stress flow, if you look at your watch and be like, wow, 2 hours just flew by, right? Where did that time go? But what's interesting, as cortisol builds up in your blood, as it builds up in your system, your body can't really handle that much of it. So we start to feel fatigue and exhausted and ill health. And that's where we get burnout, when we have too much stress in our body. And that's when you look at your watch and be like, oh dear Lord, how did that only take 17 seconds, right? It feels as though time's stuck. We know that we're experiencing fatigue and exhaustion. And what we do know is that this is where mistakes happen. This is where people are unwell. And there's actually a phenomenon that we see. Have you ever experienced this when you're under a lot of stress and then all of a sudden you get a vacation or you get a holiday and a day or two in it you get sick, right? And all of a sudden you're like, oh my gosh, how did I just get sick? The reality is that while you're in this really high state of stress, your body actually picked up bacteria and viruses, but because your blood was so toxic, it doesn't actually incubate. It doesn't actually incubate until your stress level comes down, and then all of a sudden strep throat says, oh, this place is way nicer, right? And I'll just hang out here for 5 to 7 days. That's actually what happens. And what's very interesting, we actually are worried when people never get that, ever get that break of the stress, because that's actually how we get chronic diseases. Because the cells and the viruses and bacteria will actually start to mutate because it's not meant to be in there. So that's actually how we get really, really ill. So we want to get rid of stress. Now, it's interesting. Dr. McGonigal's work says there's 3 ways that we can get rid of stress. So thankfully, there's a way we can actually clean our blood to get rid of this. And the first way, what most people are familiar with, to get rid of that stress, because we don't want you to feel that all the time. The first way we get rid of stress is through exercise. But the problem is if you've already hit that critical point of fatigue and exhaustion, you don't even have enough energy to go exercise, right? That's really, really hard to push through that fatigue, because what your body's basically telling you to do is, and again, it's from an evolutionary perspective, what your body says is you're under so much stress right now that if you were, attacked, right? Because you got to remember, we're working with a very old biology system. If you were attacked, you wouldn't be able to fight very well. So we want you to feel exhausted and just hide, right? Break down, curl up, grab some Netflix, right? Just kind of curl up and hide, because you're actually not very safe right now. You couldn't defend yourself right now. So your body, it's really hard for you to push through that. So interesting, our body's evolved because we've changed so much as a species. And the second way we get rid of stress is actually through the act of crying. And it's a very particular cry. It's a red blotchy cry and you get super snotty, right? And your skin kind of stings, right? You know it's a good cortisol cry if your face hurts, because the pH in cortisol is so strong, right? And so all of a sudden you get super snotty and super gross, and afterwards you feel so much better. And I had a good cortisol cry just recently, and I was like, oh my gosh, I needed that. I hadn't had a really great cry in a really long time. And I looked over and there was my husband, and he literally looked like deer in the headlights. And he's like, are you okay? I'm like, oh my gosh, I feel so much better. And he's like, are you sure? Because a lot just came out there, Robyne, right? You went deep and you went dark. And I'm like, oh no, but now I'm good. It's like, you can just Control-Alt-Delete everything I said. We reset the system. I am now rebooted.